Hello and welcome to today's online dialogue hosted by Rails to Trails Conservancy. I'm Kim Chesser, the State Agency Advocacy Specialist, and your host today, alongside my esteemed colleague, Kevin Mills. Our topic for today is advocating for a high-performance transportation alternatives program. Today's conversation will discuss opportunities to accelerate progress on trail and active transportation networks, key reforms in transportation alternatives implementation, and best practices for engaging with TA managers. Participants will hear how the Wisconsin Bike Fed has worked with state officials to make improvements to the TA program and have a chance to engage directly with their peers through breakouts to discuss and brainstorm ideas and solutions around TA implementation. We're hoping that by the end of this time, you will not only have learned something new, but you will also have made a connection with a fellow practitioner and grown your network. Before we get started, I want to run through a few housekeeping items and introduce our panelists. The chat will remain open and attendees are encouraged to engage in the chat box before and after breakouts. However, if you have questions for our panelists, please place it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. To facilitate collaboration, please drop your name, the state you reside in, and your organization affiliation into the chat. We're thrilled to also be joined by Kirsten Finn, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Bike Fed. However, before we get started, we'll first start with the RTC-led portion of this webinar, focused on advocating for a high-performing transportation alternatives program. Let's review the structure of today's session, as it's a bit different than our traditional webinars. This session will be 1 hour long with 2 presentations from Team RTC and Kirsten Finn. Following that, we'll move into breakout groups where folks can connect with peers and discuss shared innovations, ideas, and challenges. We'll then come back together for Q&A and for large group discussion at the end. We encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity to participate during this highly interactive event. And I will now hand it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Kim. So let's start with our agenda for today. Could you go to the previous slide, please? So we're going to focus today on the opportunity to accelerate progress on trail and active transportation networks, particularly through the Transportation Alternatives Program. So we'll be talking about key policy reforms in transportation alternatives implementation. We'll also be letting you know about RTC's data and resources to assist advocates in navigating this program. We've run something called the Transportation Alternatives Data Exchange, which for 32 years we've been tracking state implementation of transportation alternatives and its predecessor program. And we'll also talk about what we've learned about implementation best practices in the states for the program, and then look at the particular case of Wisconsin, where Kirsten will lead us through what she's been doing there. So next slide, please. So I want to focus on the concept of dedicated active transportation funding opportunities, because these are so crucial to provide stable funding, particularly in times of political uncertainty, as we have right now in Washington. And Transportation Alternatives is the largest program in the country to fund federal funding for active transportation. And it's federal money, but implemented at the state and local level. And the reason why dedicated funding is so important is because what I mean by that is you're not competing against other modes of transportation like driving or transit, but it's programs that are primarily used to fund walking and biking infrastructure. And if you've got uncertainty about the priorities of the decision maker, then you really benefit from having a program where you can plan ahead for the money to be flowing to what we're all trying to do here. So again, this is the nation's largest source of transportation funding at nearly $1.5 billion a year. There's also the Recreational Trails Program, which has its own 32-year history, but is connected to the Transportation Alternatives Program as an eligible use within Transportation Alternatives. But this program, again, implemented at the state with federal money, and is the idea behind this program was you take gas taxes paid by motorized trail vehicles like snowmobiles, and you use it to build motorized and non-motorized trails and maintain them. And then there's the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, the new kid on the block, part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law in 2021, which is implemented by the Federal Highway Administration directly and provides connectivity grants to take existing infrastructure and connect it to the places people need to go and connect between communities. And the idea of these being much larger grants than what you could get through the pre-existing programs. Next slide. So there are some key reforms from the bipartisan infrastructure law that we think are particularly rich. One is with more money for active transportation, an average of 70% more through this program, that you have an opportunity to get larger and more strategic grants for connectivity, as well as, of course, more grants. And all of that's good for filling up the pipeline of projects and moving them through. We also look to stem losses to the money in the program by restricting transfers of funds to unrelated purposes. This is something that transfers are still occurring under the new restricted rules, but at a much lesser rate than before the bipartisan infrastructure law. And then we want there to be more equitable access to funding. And one of the innovations in 2021 was to allow up to 5% of the funds to be used for technical assistance. And then there was also a change in the match requirements, making it more flexible so that a state could choose to lower the match barrier for disadvantaged communities. And then also because recreational trails program is an eligible use within transportation alternatives, trail maintenance is an eligible use, and we see lots of opportunity there as well. Next slide, please. So I want to close by just because this is a session where RTC has been working with the states on how they've been implementing their programs, sharing best practices between those states and what have you. We really want to make sure we're communicating well with our advocacy friends about the opportunities to press your state to do more and to be a good partner in moving these initiatives forward. So some of the things we've learned in doing this work that have been effective is, of course, building strong relationships with the key agency decision makers, to engage in the development of the guidelines for these programs at the state level and influencing the scoring criteria so that the project priorities are strong. And then it's always important to have your eye on planning processes, especially transportation planning, because to get federal money, you want to be in what they call the tips and the stips. You also have opportunities in safety planning and in trail and active transportation planning to embed your ideas. It's also important to help drive the ambitiousness of the plans by providing a vision for connectivity of your region. And then you want to document the impact that these things are having and that they have a strong return on investment. And so with that, we'll move to the next slide, and I'll hand it back over to Kim.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about the Transportation Alternatives Program. Funding for the Transportation Alternatives Program, or as I'll refer to it, TA, is designated by Congress and comes from the Federal Highway Administration, FHWA, and is administered by State Department of Transportation's or Metropolitan Planning Organizations, also known as MPOs. MPOs serving populations of 200,000 or more people are given responsibility for a share of TA funding. The funding's for a variety of transportation and community improvement projects, but the vast majority of awarded projects are for walking and biking infrastructure. As Kevin mentioned, Bill provides for a significant increase in funding for TA. Starting in 2022 and continuing through 2025, we are seeing the funds slowly grow from $1.38 billion to $1.5 billion annually. TA projects have a significant benefit to local economies for many reasons, and each state and MPO must develop a competitive process to allow eligible entities to submit projects for funding. You can go to the link provided on this slide to view RTC's information and resources about the TA program, and I'll discuss our resources in more detail here shortly. Next slide, please. So how do you know if your state or MPO has an effective implementation of their program? So these are some of the key questions that you can ask. How well are they obligating the money? Obligations represent a significant step in the project implementation process. And looking ahead, we're focused on increasing TA obligation rates, as we know that the project pipeline nationally far outpaces the availability of funds, and limits on transfers and other changes to the program should put more pressure on states to prioritize these investments. And states' efforts should focus on increasing the obligation rate to meet demand and ensure that funds do not lapse. How equitable is the funding distributed? More states and MPOs are placing a greater emphasis on equity and seeking to reduce the barriers to mobility, access, community connectivity, and economic development that disproportionately impact underserved communities by leveraging TA and other funding sources that benefit TA projects to provide technical assistance and match. How is your state or region performing? And how strategic and impactful are the projects that are funded? With increased program funding, there is a lot of opportunity here. Some states are implementing thoughtful policy reforms that are helping to fund more projects with a focus on things like safety and connectivity. Next slide. So here are a few examples of TA reform that we've seen recently. In Texas, we've seen with regional fund allocation that there is more of a balanced funding for urban and rural areas. Texas DOT has simplified their application process and provided additional tools to make it easier for small communities to access these funds. There's been a prioritization of projects that are ready to start, and MPOs gain more project selection power. TxDOT also created a large-scale project category, which provides more opportunities for connectivity. And as you can see, the outcomes are significant. Next slide. Thank you. So another great example is happening in Ohio. The Transportation Alternatives Program is coordinating with the Safety Funding Program and Carbon Reduction Program, also known as CRP, to increase the number of TA projects funded. Transportation Alternatives Program funding applications are reviewed for eligibility for safety funding and CRP funding. If warranted, a project could be awarded safety funding in addition to TAP funding. Bicycle and pedestrian facilities and safe routes for non-drivers projects are eligible types of CRP projects. Eligible CRP projects also receive safety funds to provide the 20% local match for these projects as well, meaning that the construction contract and construction engineering phases of the project will be 100% federally funded. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to share some of the resources that RTC has. So to help you with your advocacy work, there are several resources that you can tap into. The Transportation Alternatives Data Exchange, or TRADE, is operated by Rails to Trails Conservancy. TRADE provides an in-depth analysis of the nation's largest funding source for active transportation. From 1996 to 2013, TRADE operated as the National Transportation Enhancements Clearinghouse as a partnership between RTC and FHWA. Since 2014, RTC has continued to collect this information from states, providing the most comprehensive and long-term data available about the Transportation Alternatives Program. Some of the work that we're doing includes hosting quarterly meetings with TA managers across the country to provide a forum for them to share best practices with one another and discuss challenges. We produce and distribute the trade report annually, and we produce a webinar sharing our findings. We also survey the TA managers annually to get a better understanding of how states are implementing our priority reforms across the country. So there's a wealth of information in our Transportation Alternatives Data Exchange, and you can check it out at the links that we have, which will be dropped in the chat as well. Next slide, please. TRADE provides transparency, promotes best practices, and provides citizens, professionals, and policymakers with information and access to funding. The trade report helps stakeholders at the federal, state, and local levels understand and make effective use of the TA program. So as I mentioned earlier, we collect the data from the states annually, and we also incorporate FHWA's financial management information system data into the report. Next slide. So why TRADE? We have cumulative data that goes back from the inception of the program, as well as annual data, and we collect more specific data from states than what is collected annually by FHWA. We also do an in-depth analysis of the data, and we provide commentary on best practices and areas for improvement. RTC is happy to meet with you to dive deeper into the data and of the trade report and discuss particular jurisdictions or areas of interest with you as well. And so with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Kirsten Finn, Executive Director of Wisconsin Bike Fed. Kirsten?
Thank you so much, Kim. Hi, everyone. I'm Kirsten Finn, and Wisconsin Bike Fed is Wisconsin's statewide bicycle advocacy organization. We teach children and adults how to navigate their communities safely by bike. We advocate for bike-friendly laws and for more money to go to bike infrastructure and trails. And finally, we produce epic events that get people on their bicycles more often. We also collaborate with Rails to Trails on a Trail Nation project called the Route of the Badger, which when finished will be a 700-mile interconnected trail system in southeastern Wisconsin. Next slide. Wisconsin has a rich outdoor recreation history, particularly in cycling. We have epic bike events, we have beautiful state trails, and we also have a lot of bicycle manufacturing, including Trek, Pacific, and also Bora. And in 2010, Wisconsin ranked as the second most bike-friendly state in the country by the League of American Bicyclists. Next, please. Since then, we have been falling steadily. Mostly because our former governor, Scott Walker, spent less money developing trails and bicycle infrastructure. And in 2015, we had the distinction of being the only state in the country to repeal our complete streets policy. And then in 2017, Governor Walker also revoked the use of eminent domain for pedestrian walkways and trails. And so we now are sitting at the number 29th most bike-friendly state in the country. Next slide, please. On average, states spend 2.2% of their federal transportation dollars on biking and walking. We are sitting at just 0.6% and currently are ranked at number 49 out of 50 states on what we spend on biking and walking infrastructure. Next slide. That is even though cycling generates $1.4 billion in economic activity annually to Wisconsin. Next. So from 2014 to 2021, we obligated $7.4 million in TA funds annually to cycling projects. And this was the bare minimum that our state could obligate. In 2022 and 2023, that number increased to over $19 million because of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Next slide. To capitalize on the new money available, we founded something called the Council of Advocates, and our goal was to have one advocate in every county of our state. Right now we have 60 advocates for 72 counties. And that Council of Advocates meets quarterly and helps us to identify priority projects from each county that will most dramatically improve the connectivity of our trail network and improve safety for people biking and walking. As mentioned before, the other important change to the bipartisan infrastructure law is the ability to use up to 5% of your state's funding to offer technical assistance. Prior to this, WSDOT would offer a webinar that was often held during the day, and people who were needing that information, particularly teachers who were looking for safe routes to school funding, often missed that webinar. And so the Bike Fed petitioned WSDOT to work with them to offer technical assistance. And WSDOT was particularly challenged in how to get proposals from communities under 5,000 people. And so we focused our efforts on that area in particular. And we had a goal of getting $10 million in applications from communities of under 5,000 people. And we wound up getting $55 million in projects that year with providing the technical assistance. Next slide, please. So I attended a webinar like this one with Mary Ellen Kuntz going over RTC's trade data and learned that we had $67 million in unobligated TAP funds sitting at FHWA. And Mary Ellen was nice enough to dive into that trade data for Wisconsin specifically with the Bike Fed's legislative committee and also with executives at Trek Bicycle Company. Next slide, please. we came up with a plan to how to better use these unobligated dollars. And so we started by having Trek Bicycle Company, who is a large employer in Wisconsin, invite the WSDOT Secretary of Transportation to come to Trek for a tour and to see a presentation on the economic impact of biking and walking in Wisconsin, and also on the missed opportunity of the unobligated TAP funds. We followed up at the Bike Fed with WSDOT and offered to come prepared with a priority project list from our Council of Advocates of shovel-ready projects that could obligate these funds by July 1st of last year. Next slide, please. And we walked out of that meeting with $44 million in federal redistribution funds across these programs: transportation alternatives, carbon reduction, and congestion mitigation and air quality improvement. Next slide, please. And what that meant for us was that some of the priority projects that we were working on got accelerated quite a bit. For example, this is the Wisconsin Recreational River Bridge that will connect Dane County and Sauk County, and it had received TA funding to start building in 2027. But because we received the federal redistribution funds, it is now being built this year. Next slide, please. As mentioned before, we also were able to get more dollars to our DNR for the Recreational Trails Program through redistribution, a total of $14 million additional to what had previously been awarded to address deferred maintenance on state trails across the state.
Group, but really asked for training for rural areas. That's one of the items.
Okay, that's great.
I think in Wisconsin, it comes down to the match. And I've tried to lobby our DOT for a couple of different things. One was a matching pot. We don't hit that 15% vulnerable road user threshold, so we don't use any of our highway safety improvement dollars to match TAP. And so I had asked that we use some of the state surplus to create a matching pot for communities of under $5,000 to provide a more equitable distribution of TAP funding. That did not make the last budget. And so one of the other things that the bipartisan infrastructure law required was that every state do a vulnerable road user assessment. And this time around, I asked if we could use that vulnerable road user assessment to identify the most dangerous roads in our state and just provide a match for those projects, because they would proactively help us stay below that 15% vulnerable road user threshold. So I'm still waiting to see if that makes it through the budgeting process this time.
When you find out whether that makes it through, would you let me know? Because the road that I'm developing off of is there's a lot of wrecks on this road. The 210 foot of my road frontage, there's not one single section of that fence that hasn't been hit going the east and west direction. And it's 90-degree right now. It said it will be a 4-way intersection down the road. And going the other way, that man, they've ran into his fence so many times, he's taken the entire fence down and cut up trees in place of it. So I would be real interested to find out about that with the dangers of this road.
Do you know that some states are using their highway safety improvement program funding as a match for TAP projects that do have that safety component, and that is federal dollars. So it's, using federal funds to match federal funds. Kansas is one of them, as well as Ohio, and there's other states that are doing that as well. So that could be something to consider advocating for as well.
The problem with that is that the way the law is written stupidly is that even if a state uses its highway safety improvement program funds to match transportation alternatives, a state is still required to maintain its overall 80% federal share. So hopefully that will get fixed. There's at least the marker bill being considered to make it so that if you use the Highway Safety Improvement Program funds, it can be used as match and not count against that 80% federal share. But that has to be fixed, because the law was written very stupidly. And I think everybody finally admits that.
Thank you for sharing that, Christopher. That's a really important point. And for the advocates that are on the call, something to keep in mind as we're doing our work as well. Okay, so let me ask if this session has inspired any ideas about how to more effectively use the data as an advocacy tool. That is one thing that we spend quite a bit of time on, collecting this data and publishing it. So you saw Kirsten's example of how she used that in Wisconsin. And I'd love to hear if anyone else was inspired or has an idea of how to use that data for advocacy work.
Well, as a sociologist, I'm always inspired by data, but specifically the data, the matching funds, the programs that are in reform and have been reformed elsewhere and is working to bring all of that knowledge through the data to the table whenever it comes to face-to-face conversations and meetings with the communities around here. That will be very helpful to tell them, look, it's not coming out of your pocket, but it will benefit you as well as everybody else. And there's a much bigger picture that you can be part of. And here's the data to prove that. And that will hopefully open their eyes that this is a good thing, because this is an area where resistance to change is pretty strong.
Thank you, Becky.
You're welcome.
Hey, if anyone else have any closing comments, and we'll move on to our last slide if not. Okay, so I want to share with you, I talked about several of the RTC resources in my presentation, and I just want to share our final slide that has that information for you. And we will share all of this on our website after the dialogue as well. But could we advance to the next slide, please? Okay, so resources and tools. RTC can provide technical assistance to work with you, much like Kirsten described her work with Mary Ellen. We're happy to help and be a resource to the local advocacy groups. And also, the work that we do with the transportation alternatives managers, we're learning quite a bit about really good best practices that are occurring in the states and really thoughtful policy reform. And we can share that information with you and how it's being done in those states. We also have several web resources that are available to you. There is the trade report and the trade database that we maintain. We have federal funding resources. We host frequent webinars and online dialogues that are available, and you can go to our website page and view past webinars and dialogues if you're interested in that. We recently did a couple of webinars for change makers and how to create change and see the results that you want around active transportation and trails. So I would encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't seen that. We have our Trail Nation playbook and our trail building toolbox, which is just a wealth of resources for trail building. And we also have our Trail Nation Collaborative. So if you are not a member of that, I highly encourage you to join that. And we have our resources library, which is full of a digital repository. So there's quite a few resources and tools there that are available to help you in the work that you do. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and feel free to reach out to me at any time if you want to have further follow-up and discussion around the Transportation Alternatives Program. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.